For many millenniums, humans and monsters waged war against each other. The war ensued for so long that they eventually forgot why they were fighting in the first instance. However, with the passing of time, humans and monsters settled their fight and started living together peacefully. Humans and monsters also started specializing in numerous fields such as medicine, and one of these specialists was a human doctor named Dr. Litbeit, who lives in Lindworm, a city where humans and monsters live together peacefully. On this particular morning, Glenn was seen going for another one of his morning checkups on a patient named Syria, whom he diagnosed with pregnancy. Later on, Saphentite, his assistant, scolds him for treating female patients with too much care and attention. She also asks him to call her Sappy like he formerly did when they schooled at the medical academy together. Later that night, a message arrives at Glenn's clinic, and Glenn informs Sappy that they'll be conducting a medical checkup at Lindworm Central Hospital because Dr. Thule, their mentor, had a lot of medical cases to attend to and had delegated her duties to them. The next day, Sappy complains about Sifili always passing down the hardest of tasks to Glenn, but Glenn smiles and tells her that it's only because she wants him to gain more experience. After they step out of the carriage, they are welcomed by a group of arena fighters, and a centaur introduces herself as Tessalia Scythio, one of the best fighters in the arena, who happens to be the princess of the centaurs and the heiress to Scythia transportation. After getting himself acquainted with the locals, Glenn carried out some medical checkups on the women while Sappy used her tail to grab the women who kept throwing themselves at Glenn. Princess Tessalia eventually dropped by for a checkup and asked Glenn if he would love to marry her, especially since he was the best suitor available at the moment, but Sappy makes snide remarks about how Tessalia's records show that her waist size has increased in the past few months. Glenn assures Tessalia that she's in perfect condition, but after she leaves, Kay and Lorna, Princess Tessalia's attendants, visit Glenn to ask if the princess was suffering from any ailment. Glenn reveals that there is nothing medically wrong with her, but Kay and Lorna hesitate before telling them that their princess, who rarely ever won a match, had lost her last few matches. Later that night, Sappy rejoices about how they'll be going home the next day because they were done with their medical checkups, but Glenn tells her that he doesn't feel comfortable with going home, especially after what he heard about Princess Tessalia. He decides to stay up all night to find out if Princess Tessalia had an illness that couldn't be discovered through physical checkups, and Sappy offers him some wine to keep him awake. The following day, Sappy is challenged to another battle in the arena, and she loses this round, making it her 10th loss in a row. She is greatly distressed about this, as she feels like she is dragging her family's name in the mud, and she pushes herself to train harder than before. While Princess Tessalia trains in the stables, she is surprised when Glenn appears and tells her that he had found out the reason for her past losses. He reveals that it's because Tessalia's hooves had never been shod, and it was now growing in an uneven pattern, making it harder for her to balance her feet while she fought. Princess Tessalia refuses to have her hooves shod, but Kay and Lorna enter the stable and hold her in place as some blacksmiths create shoes for her, while Glenn tries to attach the shoes to her hooves. Tessalia moans dramatically, and Sappy holds her in place before shutting her up by stuffing her mouth. The shoes are finally attached, and Tessalia nags Glenn and Saphentite for doing such a distasteful thing to a princess. The following week, Princess Tessalia gives Glenn and Saphentite a special seat in the arena, and they watch as Tessalia goes on to win her 3rd match in a row. Sappy asks why Dr. Thule never bothered to check Tessalia's hooves in the first place, and Glenn tells her that she probably knew but had only tried to test him in the first place. He also reminds her of how Dr. Thule always respected her clients' wishes, and she wouldn't want to perform medical procedures on her patients without their permission. Later on, Sappy recalls how Glenn's family had taken her as a child hostage while they worked with her family to end the war. Glenn's family had kept her hostage just in case her family decided to betray them. However, she was released after the war came to an end. However, Glenn and Sappy had grown close during her stay with his family, and when the time came for her to leave, they were both saddened by this. Glenn's relationship with Sappy sparked his interest in medicine for monsters, so he decided to become a medical doctor who specialized in the treatment of monsters. After enrolling in lamia, a medical school which trained humans and monsters in medical treatment for monsters, Glenn was pleasantly surprised to discover that Sappy had also ventured into the field of medicine. Sappy is brought out of her trance as Glenn steps in and asks if she has run out of her sunblock ointment. She realizes that her sunblock has actually finished, and Glenn suggests that they visit the Marrow waterways to get some supplies. Glenn asks Sappy to promise him that they would only get necessary supplies as they had lots of work to do later, but she gets fascinated by different objects and stops by the gift shop. On their way home, they encounter a young mermaid named Lulala Hine, and she persuades them to purchase something from her shop. Sappy asks her what she's selling, and Lulala tells them that she's an excellent singer. Glenn asks Lulala to sing 2 songs for the price of 1, and he promises to pay her by giving her a medical examination. Lulala captivates Glenn and Sappy with her angelic voice, but she stops abruptly while singing her first song. Glenn offers to examine her in a private place, and he asks their marrower to take them somewhere quiet. The merman leads her to the canal, and after Glenn examines Lulala, he realizes that her gills had stopped working efficiently because she was almost always outside the water. He further reveals that her body had gotten accustomed to how she constantly breathed with her lungs that was starting to forget how to breathe underwater. Lulala tells Glenn that she has to stay above water to sing to passersby and earn enough money to take care of her mother and siblings. While she explains this to Glenn, a young boy in the vicinity drowns and Lulala swims to his rescue. Safi and Glenn ask him to steer them in that direction, but the merman tells them that he can't do this because the canal's currents were way too strong and would only overturn the boat. Lulala brings the human boy to shore and Glenn tries to resuscitate him. But after he succeeds in waking the human boy, Glenn realizes that Lulala is drowning and he dives in after her. Glenn swims toward the surface while carrying her and he tries to help her with using her gills to breathe underwater. Glenn gives her some oxygen by performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation underwater, but he swallows way too much water and almost drowns. Safi arrives in time and saves them by drawing them out with her tail. Later on, Lulala's gills become more accustomed to swimming underwater and Lady Skatey offers Lulala a spot at the city's singing show. Lulala thanks Glenn for his help, but Safi gets jealous at the fact that Glenn kissed Lulala underwater. She realizes that Lulala has a crush on Glenn, but she tells him that she wants them to stay on somewhat friendly terms since she considers Lulala as a younger sister. Later on, Kumai Zanao, a female soldier, is seen running from some armed men. She is cornered by them, but she attacks them without hesitation. Meanwhile, Dr. Glenn is seen helping a slime to retain her physical form by immersing her in a bio-liquid. But right after she leaves, someone knocks on the clinic's front door, and he is surprised to see Lady Skatey Dragonfelt, the city council representative, who happened to be the genius behind Lindworm. Lady Skatey was a dragon who had taken on the form of a human after descending from heaven. She had succeeded in building Lindworm, a city where humans and monsters could cohabitate peacefully in just 10 years. She was also rumored to be the central figure in Lindworm, and everyone treated her respectfully. Kunai Zenel, her bodyguard, steps forward and speaks on her behalf. She tells them that she would be speaking on behalf of Lady Skatey, and she reveals that she had been tracking some slavers when she fell into one of their traps. Kumai had faced 10 men and taken them down, but she lost her arm in the process. At the mention of this, Kumai bows her head and apologizes to Lady Skatey. She further reveals that Lady Skatey wants them to find her hand and attach it back. Glenn is honored that Lady Skatey stopped by his clinic, even though she could have easily approached his mentor who owned the city's largest hospital. However, Sappy tells Lady Skatey that Glenn can't treat Kunai Zeno because she's a golem and he has no experience treating them. They're all surprised when Glenn tells Lady Skatey that he would be honored to treat Kunai. But as soon as Lady Skatey leaves, Kunai tells Glenn that she would find her arm herself and she asks him not to follow her. Kunai encounters one of the slavers on her way to find her arm and she is attacked by the slaver who cuts off her left leg before running away. Kunai crawls away from the spot with the hopes of locating her left hand before the slaver arrives with the rest of his crew. At the clinic, Sappy tells Glenn of how golems are creatures that are made from the flesh and souls of dead human bodies, and Glenn tells her that the person who had created Sappy was probably a deranged doctor, as he finally understands Kunai's deep-rooted hatred for doctors. After a while, Dr. Glenn tells Sappy that he's going out in search of Kunai Zeno and her missing arm. But on getting to the market square, he runs into Princess Tisalia, who informs him that she had just seen a detached leg. Princess Tisalia is stunned by how he carries it without feet, but Glenn tells her that the detached leg belongs to Kunai Zeno. Princess Tisalia reveals that she was acquainted with Kunai Zeno and had always admired her because she was not just the bodyguard of Lady Skatey, the central figure in the city, but also a first-ranked fighter with the highest number of consecutive wins in the arena. Glenn strokes Kunai's leg and he realizes that she could feel it because Golem's genetic makeup allows them to sense all contact with their skin with the exception of pain. Glenn goes in search of Kunai, who informs him of the rumors that he was gathering body parts for an experiment. She gives him Kunai's missing arm and tells him that someone had dropped it in the canal. Lulala tells Glenn where to find Kunai and he walks off to the location. Despite Kunai's protests, he joins her sutures with care before telling her that a fake doctor with mental problems was probably responsible for creating her. Meanwhile, Sappy worries about Glenn's whereabouts in Arania. Her best friend stops by and tells her that Glenn is probably busy flirting with a patient in town. Sappy feels jealous at the implication of Arania's words and she chases her off. But before she leaves, Arania gives her an egg that she had found in the streets. Glenn finishes up by joining Kunai's stitches and Kunai thanks Glenn for treating her despite how badly she had treated him. But unknown to them, some slavers watch them from a dark corner and follow them back home. Glenn arrives shortly after Arania leaves and he is surprised when Sappy reveals that she is pregnant. Glenn is bewildered by this cause he knows for a fact that Sappy had never mated with anyone, and Sappy reveals that the egg was a gift from Arania, her best friend. Upon further inspection, Glenn realizes that it's a harpy's egg and he tells Sappy that a harpy girl had probably lost it. He also explains that harpies are oviparous and always give birth when undergoing ovulation. Sappy's serpent instincts tell her that they're under attack, and they escape just before the slavers get in. They run into Kunai, who explains that she had been tracking down the slavers who kidnapped young harpy girls and forced them into ovulation before selling them to humans with illegal tastes. She reveals that she was currently accompanying Lady Skadi to the slavers' hideout to rescue some harpies, and she asks them to tag along. Staffy asks why civilians were being asked to infiltrate a hideout, and Lady Skadi reveals that they had received word that one of the female harpies was ovulating. They go to the Marrow's waterway, and Glenn is surprised that Lulala works as a marrower for Lady Skadi despite her young age. He accuses Lady Skadi of taking advantage of her, but Lulala speaks up for herself and tells him that she marrows in exchange for singing at the central hall and got a large sum of money that was more than sufficient to feed her family. On their way back to the slavers' hideout, they are attacked by some armed men, but Princess Tissalia and her attendants rescue them. Lulala takes them down the waterways before dropping them off at the slavers' hideout. But as soon as they climb down the boat, they are attacked by another slaver. Kunai attacks him and asks Sappy and Glenn to enter the slavers' hideout. They arrive at the hideout, and Glenn notices the teenage harpies huddled around Illy, a harpy who he discovers to be pregnant. Glenn assists Illy with giving birth, but the slavers arrive during the operation. To everyone's surprise, Sappy rises to Glenn's defense despite being asked to hide her skills in martial arts. Unfortunately, while Sappy fights against the slavers, she is hit by a poison knife and passes out due to the effects of the poison. Later on, Sappy wakes up and reveals how she had been trained in martial arts before being sent to his family as a hostage. She further reveals that she had been asked to kill his family if they went against the negotiations that were being made to stop the war. Glenn reveals that his family had known of this fact, and a servant had secretly tried to poison her on the first week of her arrival. He also reminds her of how he had stayed by her side and nursed her to health, but he thanks her for this because he had learned everything he knew about medicine from there. Sappy is so shocked by how Glenn had treated her with care despite her evil intentions toward him, and she tries making a move on him. But while she does this, she is suddenly paralyzed, and Glenn explains that the poison had not entirely left her body and one of its symptoms was paralysis. Glenn blushes as he tells her not to exert herself too much. He also reveals that he is going for an in-house checkup on a patient, and Sappy covers her face in embarrassment. Later on, Glenn's mentor, Lady Cully, asks him to visit the Harpy village to carry out some physical examination on the residents, and Princess Tissalia offers to give him a ride because she has a meeting with the village council elder and Illy has asked to see her. Sappy accompanies Glenn, and she tells him of how Illy had lost so many feathers that she could no longer fly. She also tells him of how Illy was an orphan with no parents or guardians to watch over her. The carriage stops abruptly, and Glenn and Sappy step out to see Princess Tissalia, Kay, and Lorna face flat on the floor. They explain that it's because of the rough terrain, and Glenn asks if Princess Tissalia is okay. She tells him that she feels fine, but unfortunately, Kay had gotten hurt while trying to shield her. Some harpy men who were members of Sikia Transportation arrive on the scene and aid them in carrying Kay to the village. They arrive at the village, and Lorna promises Kay that she would take care of Princess Tissalia, but unfortunately, Lorna is unable to perform her duties efficiently because she is worried about Kay. Glenn and Sappy come up with a way to make Kay more efficient in her duties by disciplining her. Glenn blindfolds Lorna and asks her to focus more on Princess Tissalia and remember her duties. This helps her in becoming more efficient, and Princess Tissalia thanks Glenn for his help. Later on, Lorna tells Kay of how Glenn had helped her with performing her duties more efficiently, and Kay suggests that they thank him more intimately. After a while, Kay recuperates fully, and Sappy suggests that they leave after Illy allows them to examine her. They visit Illy, and Glenn examines her, but he tells her that nothing is wrong with her. Glenn also reveals that she is molting. Illy claims that Glenn is a fake doctor before storming off in anger. Princess Tissalia follows after her because she recalls how Illy had originally wanted to speak with her. She flares up and leaves. Princess Tissalia follows because she wanted a word with Princess Tissalia. Princess Tissalia confronts Illy and asks her what she was really making a fuss about. Illy tells her that she wants to be an arena fighter, but Tissalia tells her that fighting is about etiquette and a rude girl like her would never win. Illy challenges Tissalia to battle with the condition that she would become an arena fighter if she wins. Tissalia accepts the challenge, and she wins the match. However, she arrives at Glenn's clinic with a scratch on her neck from Illy's talons. Glenn asks if she wasn't badly hurt, but Tissalia reveals that she had beaten Illy in a duel and refused to make her an arena fighter. She also tells Glenn that becoming an arena fighter wouldn't have helped Illy because she was so used to running from her problems and staying on her own that she would have only run again. Glenn suddenly has an idea, and he asks Sappy and Tissalia to help him with gathering Illy's feathers. After examining the feathers, Glenn realizes that they have a different color in them and surmises that she's undergoing a special type of molting. They go in search of her, and they're surprised when a village scout informs them that Illy is missing. They search around the village for her, and they eventually find her on the branch in a forest tree. Glenn tells Illy that she would soon regain her ability to fly, but she doesn't believe him. He eventually convinces her that she's going through a special type of molting which teenagers often experience before growing their adult wings. He also reveals that the reason why her molting feathers have different colors in them is because she is the descendant of a phoenix. Illy's adult feathers eventually grow and she thanks Glenn and apologizes for insulting him. Illy stutters while talking to Glenn and Sappy implies that she has a crush on him. She runs off in embarrassment before showing off her new wings to other teenage harpies and telling them that would soon become an adult. Later on, Illy flies in through Glenn's window and complains about encountering a yucky substance in the forest that wouldn't come off her wings. He inspects it and realizes that it's the thread of an arachnida, a half spider, half human, and he tells her to wash it off with hot water or bath in a spring. After a while, other female harpies rush in with the same complaints, and Sappy uses her tail to keep them away from Glenn. Glenn tells her that they'll have to get to the root cause of the problem, and they visit the forest in search of the arachnida. Sappy tells him to be wary of traps since arachnidas were exceptionally good at setting traps, but Glenn falls into a trap. The arachnida, who was responsible for the harpy's misfortunes, arrives, and it turns out to be Arania, Sappy's best friend. Arania releases Glenn and gushes about meeting the man whom her best friend was always talking about. Sappy introduces Arania to Glenn and tells him of how Arania was the most famous dressmaker in Lindworm. They ask her what she's doing in the harpies' village, and she reveals that she had heard rumors that the legendary bird, a phoenix, which had not been seen for decades, was now present in the forest. She also tells them of her plans to catch it and use some of its feathers for her next design. Glenn tells her that the phoenix is Illy, a half-harpy who lived in the harpy village, but they ask her to promise them that she wouldn't do anything to hurt her. They introduce Arania to Illy, but she pesters Illy and follows her around the entire village while trying to get a closer look at her feathers. While Arania chases Illy about, she runs into Princess Tisalia and gets some of her web on her. Princess Tisalia rushes off to Glenn to complain about this, and Glenn tells her that the strange substance on her is an arachnida's web. Sappy gets jealous of the amount of attention that Glenn is doling out to Princess Tisalia, and she storms off in anger. Glenn doesn't understand her actions, but Princess Tisalia draws his attention to the fact that Sappy was working around the clock to impress him, even though lamias such as herself were known to fare badly in the cold weather that the harpies' village was well known for. She tells him to pay more attention to Sappy before walking away. Later on, Glenn gives Sappy a glass of wine and thanks her for her hard work and endless commitment to work. A loud booming sound alerts everyone in the village, and the village elder sends scouts to investigate the cause of the commotion. The following day, Glenn offers Sappy a drink before telling her to relax and take a warm bath in the village spring. As soon as Sappy leaves, Arania arrives and complains that she's feeling ill. Glenn carries out a physical examination, but he tells her that nothing is visibly wrong with her. However, she might be down with a cold. Glenn asks her to be more physically active and suggests that she take a warm bath in the spring, but Arania tells him that she would prefer to take a walk in the forest. Glenn expresses concern on her desire to visit the forest despite having a cold, and Arania asks him to escort her if he is so concerned. Glenn escorts her for a while, but after realizing that Arania was probably feeling much better, he asks to take his leave. Just as he turns to take a leave, he falls into Arania's trap, and she gleefully reveals that she plans to strengthen her bond with Sappy by making a move on him. Just when she's about to make good on her words, Princess Tisalia charges in and rescues Glenn from her grasp. She confesses her genuine love for Glenn and accuses Arania of committing a despicable deed. But Sappy arrives and interrupts Princess Tisalia's speech before stealing Glenn away. She tells the two of them that she had heard their entire conversation and was tired of hearing people's declaration of love for the doctor. She also reveals that Glenn was too busy with work and not ready to get married or engaged, but she fails to notice that her tail is wrapped too tightly around Glenn that he suffocates in the process. Arania and Tisalia draw her attention to this, and she rushes him off to the clinic. After Glenn awakes, Arania apologizes for hurting him, but Glenn tells her that he understands that she never truly meant to hurt him. Sappy loads up on alcohol and Glenn tries to make her feel better. He apologizes for not paying her enough attention. Sappy suddenly confesses her love for him, and she tells him that while she tries to keep her emotions in check, too many worthy opponents kept creeping up. She further reveals that while she wasn't scared of Arania, she was scared of Princess Tisalia, who seemed to have genuine feelings for him. Glenn assuages her fears by telling her that while he couldn't foresee the future, she was the only one he enjoyed sharing a glass of wine in this way. The ground trembles after Glenn's proclamations, and Sappy assumes that it's because Glenn just said something cheesy, but the ground trembles again and they go out to investigate. The village elder tells them that the scouts had discovered that one of the harpies' gods, an elder goddess also known as a giant, was making her way down to the village. Princess Tisalia asks the villagers to move because they believe that they're under a curse, and the giant wants to destroy them. She asks Kay and Lorna to convey some of the harpies who are unable to fly, while the others walk down the mountain. While Glenn accompanies the villagers, he notices that Tisalia is not present and correctly assumes that she went to face the jig alone. Meanwhile, Tesselia stays back at the village and gives herself a pep talk as she prepares to face the elder goddess, but Saphi arrives and meets Tesselia, giving herself a pep talk. Saphi teases Tesselia about choosing to fight an elder goddess despite being scared. Tesselia is shocked when Glenn suddenly appears and tells her that he has a better option. He tells them of his plans to talk to the goddess, but Saphi and Tesselia try to discourage him. He eventually convinces them to follow through with his plan, and they discover that the female giant had walked down the mountain because she wanted treatment for a cold. Glenn gives her a physical checkup and accidentally falls into her garment, but she picks him up and drops him on the ground. Glenn prescribes some drugs for her, and the village elder suggests that they make sure she never gets a cold so she doesn't have to walk down the mountains or alert the villagers. Glenn asks Arania to make some clothes for the female goddess, but she complains that she doesn't have enough thread. People donate their clothes to her, and Arania makes some thick clothing for the elder goddess. Later on, Illy visits Glenn and drops an invitation for the waterway commemoration ceremony. After she leaves, Princess Tesselia reveals that Illy was now working as a messenger under the Scythia transportation system. Glenn goes out on a date with Princess Tesselia, and he thanks her for her willingness to sacrifice herself for the villagers, but Saphi interrupts them. Saphi admits that Princess Tesselia had done a selfless act and she admired her. However, her actions now prove that she was a formidable opponent in the race for Glenn's heart, and she wouldn't allow them to have some alone time. The following day, they arrive at the waterways commemoration ceremony, and they run into Lady Skady, who informs them of how Arania was sewing clothes for the mermaids. She also tells him that she is glad that everyone is living happier and better lives, and she walks forward to say her speech. Kunai accompanies her to say her speech on her behalf, but Lady Skady passes out. Glenn rushes forward to administer medical treatment, and the entire city is thrown into an uproar. Later on, the excitement of the afternoon dies down, and Saphi complains about how Thule had not told them of Lady Skady's health condition, even though Glenn had attended to her on the spot. They arrive at Thule's office, and she flirts with Glenn and wraps her tentacles around him, but Saphi gets jealous. She stops caressing Glenn after complaining that he has aged a bit since she last saw him, and Saphi spitefully remarks that Dr. Thule is still obsessed with young men. Thule tells them that Lady Skady believes that she has an incurable disease and she has had it for a long term, but she refused to get treated. She assured them that she'll wake up soon because the only symptom she had shown was high blood pressure, and all she needs is good nutrition and lots of rest. However, her ailment would come back in full force. Later on, Kunai stops by Glenn's clinic and tells them that Lady Thule is selfishly saying it's her time to die. She begs Glenn to examine her secretly and arranges for him to do so the following day. The next day, Glenn and Saphi arrive at the palace, but Kunai restricts Saphi from following Glenn. Lady Skady is stunned to see Glenn, but she realizes that Kunai had asked him to examine her, and she allows him to go through with the checkup. After giving her a physical checkup, Glenn discovers that she has a tumor in her heart, and he examines her so delicately that she moans. Kunai and Saphi barge in on them, and Kunai is stunned to see Lady Skady on her knees, so she threatens to kill him. Saphi is fully in support of her decisions, but to their surprise, Lady Skady tells them that she's fine. Saphi and Glenn visit Dr. Thule's office and tell her that Lady Skady's disease could be cured. They try convincing her to help them, but she initially refuses because she believes that Lady Skady would never agree to go through with the surgery. She eventually agrees to help them if Glenn succeeds in convincing Lady Skady to carry out the surgery, but she asks them to get someone who is skilled in using thread and has many hands. She also tells them that the person doesn't have to be skilled, and Glenn suggests that they ask Arania for help. Arania initially refused to help because she could get in trouble if the surgery isn't successful, but she eventually agrees to help. Glenn and Saphi leave Arania to prepare for the surgery, but Glenn apologizes on their way back home because he realizes that Arania would cause a lot of problems in the clinic. The next day, Kunai asks Lady Skady if there's any improvement in her health, but Lady Skady tells her that she feels the same. Kunai arrives at Glenn's clinic and allows Arania to practice surgery on her, especially since she was impervious to pain. Later on, Glenn tells them that he's leaving for the blacksmith's workshop. He meets Meme, a shy cyclops who keeps running into trouble because she always keeps her head down and lacks self-confidence. He asks her to take him to the leader, but after meeting up with him, he asks him if he could provide numerous surgery equipment within the next month. He also requests for a suture needle that was not just tiny, but strong enough to cut through dragon scale. The leader delegates the task of designing the suture needle to Meme to increase her self-confidence, but she shows reluctance to do it. The leader asks her to have more faith in herself and convinces her to design the suture needle. Later on, Glenn and Dr. Thule check on the blacksmith's progress, and they are shown the new equipment, but the leader apologizes that Meme is yet to provide the suture needle. Glenn tells him that he understands his decision to give such an enormous task to Meme. He also tells him of how he handled his first surgery without Dr. Thule's help, and it was also a major operation. He reveals that it helped him gain more evidence of his skills as a doctor, and Lady Thule asks Glenn if he would love to bite her tail, but he refuses and slaps it away. Meanwhile, Meme works on designing the needle. She suddenly gets an idea and turns to stare at the pounding machine. After starting at it for so long, she passes out due to motion sickness, and Glenn examines her. He surmises that it's because of the heat waves, and he rips up her shirt to ease her breathing. He also asks the Cyclops to assist him with carrying her. Later on, Meme wakes up in Glenn's clinic, and she reveals that she had been nervous about creating the suture needles because Lady Skady had inspired her as a kid after asking Cyclops to stop making weapons of war. She also instructed them to use their skills in creating surgical instruments. Ming tells Glenn that she so badly wanted to save Lady Skady, but she suddenly notices that her shirt has been ripped apart, and she covers herself in embarrassment. Orania tells Glenn to be more careful with female clothing in the future, cause clothes were everything to a woman. Orania sews a new cloth for Meme, and Glenn examines her. It reveals that she had passed out because of motion sickness, which was common to Cyclops, since they'd only had one eye. Glenn, Safi, and Orania accompany Meme to the workshop, and Meme reveals that she has discovered how to mass-produce the suture needles and increase their strength. She succeeds in creating a tiny but strong suture needle, and Glenn thanks her for her efforts and asks her to keep her head up high in the future. He tells her that it would help her in avoiding accidents in the future, but she asks if her eyebrows are weird. Glenn compliments her and tells her that it's one of the things that make her unique, but she accuses him of using his wiles on her before running off. Orania asks if she could develop a better way to deal with her shyness, and Glenn tells Orania and Safi the compliments were probably too much for her, but they eye her retreating figure with envy. Later on, Lady Skady attends a council meeting, and Kunai speaks on her behalf while assisting their fears and assuring them that she's back on her feet. At the clinic, Orania complains to Glenn about how the medical records were scattered, and she wonders who is responsible for this. Glenn tells Orania that he has some work to do, and he asks her to eat without him because he'll be staying out late. After he leaves, Orania advises Safi to make a move on him, but Safi assures her that as long as she waits, Glenn would always come back for her. Orania tells Safi that Glenn is lucky to be loved, but Safi suggests that they go out for a ladies' night out. Safi invites Princess Tessalia, and Orania is shocked by her presence. After a while, Orania tells them that she believes true love between BFS should be signified by the tying of a red thread. Later that night, Safi catches Orania as she tries to steal the dragon leaf she gave Glenn. Orania returns the dragon leaf, but she climbs out of the window. She is apprehended by Tessalia, and Safi joins her in dragging Orania to the clinic. Orania asks how Safi had known that she was planning on doing something cruel, but Safi tells her that she had been acting strangely in the past few weeks. She also tells Orania that she was aware that her attempt at seducing Glenn was only a test to determine how strong their friendship bond is. Orania asks why they were both treating her with care despite knowing of her past crimes, but Safi tells her that she knew fully well that Orania was a good person at heart, but was only trying to keep a bad girl's image. Orania tells them that she couldn't understand their actions, and she also reveals that Glenn was more confusing, especially since he continued to treat her with care and respect despite knowing that she had disarranged his medical records and caused a lot of trouble in the clinic. Safi gives Tessalia a knowing look and gives Orania a love test. She realizes that Orania is in love with Glenn, but Orania is surprised by this as she had never had a first-hand experience of love. The following day, Glenn visits Lady Skady, and he carries her while giving her a view of the city. She tells him how dragons were meant to stay in heaven, but they had descended to interfere in the war. She also reveals that it had taken her 10 years to grow the city, and she was proud of the city it was becoming. She further reveals that she had gotten greedy, and she had wanted to see people and monsters as they thrived and lived in peace and harmony. Glenn tells her that there's a lot more that she can do, and he also asks her to allow him to help her in watching the city as it grew. Lady Skady finally agrees to have the surgery, and Glenn works with Orania, Safi, and Dr. Thule in operating her. Despite encountering numerous problems, the surgery is completed successfully, and Lady Skady gives a public speech without Kunai's help. She also explains that it was because of her health condition that she couldn't raise her voice in public. Later on, Safi falls ill, and Glenn examines her. He realizes that she has a sore on her tongue, and he applies some honey on it. Glenn tells Safi that he has some in-house checkups to do. He also tells her that he'll be back soon. Glenn leaves for work, but he encounters Lady Skady and Kunai. Lady Skady calls him Big Brother and asks him to hang out with her, but Glenn tells her that he still has some in-house checkups to do. He manages to persuade her that he'll hang out with her later. Lady Skady is unable to leave as she discovers that her carriage has encountered some issues, but Meme passes by at that moment and offers to fix it. Before Lady Skady leaves, she gives Meme and Glenn 2 barrels of wine. Glenn asks Meme to guard the wine, and she almost passes out in embarrassment as the villagers give her weird looks. Meanwhile, Orania helps Safi to dress up before asking her to help with preparing some food for Glenn. Safi is surprised that Orania was now acting like a dedicated lover, but she indulges her. At the Harpies' village, the female goddess helps them in lifting boulders, and the Harpies gift her with food and wine. However, she reveals that she came bearing gifts of food as well. The council elder complains about the food being too much for the villagers, and he asks some scouts to gift the food to their friends in Lindworm. Glenn returns to Meme, and he apologizes for keeping her waiting. He also informs her that Princess Tissalia and her attendants had offered to help them out with carrying the barrels of wine. Kay gives Mime a lift while helping her with transporting the barrel of wine. Princess Tissalia and Lorna drop Glenn at the clinic, and Safi is surprised when he arrives with a bulk load of food and wine. He tells them that everyone he had seen on the way back had gifted him with food as Arania laments about the problems associated with liking a popular man. She tells Safi that she finally understands her pains and asks how she has been surviving. Mime arrives with a barrel of wine and the other Cyclops, and the Cyclops suggest that they share the wine with everyone. Glenn remarks that the food was way too much, and Safi asks Arania to assist her in preparing the food for the Harpies' village and the entire city. After Arania and Safi had finished preparing food for everyone, the people gathered together and made merry. Tissalia and Safi tease Arania as she complains that Glenn is way too popular, but Tissalia notices Glenn walking up to Lady Scatty, and she tells the others that it would seem that they just got another noteworthy opponent. Lady Scatty cozies up to Glenn and asks him to hang out with her, but Safi walks up to her and drags him off before telling her that she doesn't care if she's the legendary Lady Scatty. Arania and Tissalia rush over to the scene and fight over him, but Lady Scatty tells them that she'll be settling the matter by grabbing him for a minute. Safi, Tissalia, and Arania drag him away from her, and the villagers laugh as they fall on their faces. But while Glenn was greatly admired by the entire city, Glenn's adventures with his numerous patients and admirers has only just begun. If you like this recap, do let me know in the comments, and obviously leave your like too. Do not forget to share with your friends and subscribe. Above all, activate your notification bell so you don't miss the next recap when it drops. Until next time, do take care and stay safe.